Get my 6. Greetings, everybody. Welcome back to Homesteading Off the Grid, the most awesomest homesteading channel on the internet that has absolutely nothing to do with homesteading. So the last time we were together here, listening to wonderful Halloween-flavored tales for October nights, I read you a story submitted by our viewer, Charlie in England, where he talked about his influence in becoming a storyteller, a writer, and his teacher, John Smith. And he shared with us a story that his teacher told him that really inspired him about when he was on leave during the war, in World War II. He was actually in a romantic relationship with a shapeshifter. Tonight, I'm going to read you a story from October Nights, Part 1, 31 Tales for the Halloween season. Because as you know, there was a sequel. There's a Part 2. And you can get these books on Amazon and print or Kindle. Links in the description box below. Oh my gosh, that's a chainsaw. I thought something was coming running at me, growling. So anyway, this story tonight is called PJ's Cabin. This goes back to my influence as a storyteller. An old man lived up on a mountain above where I grew up named PJ. And in this story, he tells his story that was so fascinating to me as a youth that really inspired me to become a storyteller. So just ignore him. He's a wonderful neighbor, great guy. Almost 80, and he still cuts, splits, and stacks his own firewood. That's what he's doing over there. So we are not perturbed at all that he's over there doing that. Hey, man, it's that old and still gets out there and does that. He could do that right here beside me, wouldn't interrupt me. Respect, you know what I mean? Got so many people half his age that are too lazy to break their leaves or cut their grass. And this guy's over here cutting, splitting, and stacking firewood. So this story is called PJ's Cabin. Every fall, when the changing of the colors of the leaves on the trees is at its peak, usually mid to late October, here we are, there's a special place I always go in my mind. I went to this place instinctively in late October, even when I was living in Asia or the Middle East, and there was no changing of any leaves, but the heart knows when it's time to go, and it tells the mind. So though I may have been surrounded by desert sands or walking along beautiful tropical beaches, in my mind, I was back in the mountains of Appalachia at that special place in that special cabin. There's a small hand-built cabin that sits on top of a mountain called Fork Mountain because it is in the middle of two main forks of a river named Cherry. This cabin, PJ's Cabin, is where I met a man named Philip James Abels, or PJ, as his friends called him. And PJ was the greatest storyteller I ever knew. Yes, we're talking about the same PJ here who in an earlier story, and I read you that one earlier this month, introduced us to Old Red Eyes. But long before he introduced some of my childhood best friends and me to Old Red Eyes, he'd introduced us to plenty of other ghosties and ghoulies by way of his tall tales, most of which we had every reason to believe were true. When PJ would allow us to spend the nights or the weekends or even a week during hunting season in his old cabin that he and his family had lived in for years, before moving to the foot of the mountain it sat on due to harsh winters, he would always join us and tell us the most spine-tingling tales we'd ever heard. PJ's Cabin was a very special place, and it's only because the man who'd built it and who'd allowed us to use it and who'd joined us told us his tales when we stayed there. PJ was a special person indeed. The first tale PJ ever told us is one that I still consider his best. It was a story, not that took place in his cabin, but at an old abandoned house in an old abandoned town about 50 miles away from his cabin. Many folks don't realize it, but there are plenty of abandoned towns and communities out in the hills of Appalachia, the Blue Ridge Mountains, and pretty much any secluded forested area across the entire United States. Many of them were coal or timber towns, at least in Appalachia, that had been walked away from by all residents after aforementioned resources were used up or fully harvested. There are also some old abandoned towns out there in the middle of the woods that were started as Christian missions that never gained traction and were merely deserted after several houses and a town hall or other public building was built. They're out there, these small abandoned and now overgrown hamlets, and PJ's first story took place in one such place. Before we get to PJ's first story, however, I'd like to tell you a bit of a funny story about the first time that a couple of my buddies and I spent the night in PJ's cabin. We knew he and his family no longer lived in the cabin, and we knew he used it basically as a man cave or a hunting camp. He'd told us as much before when we'd run into him out in the woods, which was regularly, because as boys we lived in the woods, and as a man so did PJ. Actually, it's how we'd met him. We were all just out in the woods at the same place and at the same time one day. I believe it might have been squirrel season and we'd all been out hunting. Anyway, we fantasized about spending the night in PJ's cabin, especially in October. It was hunting season. We could wake up in the morning and already be out there with the squirrels and the turkeys or the deer if we'd taken our bows. And as kids who lived in town, with all the modern conveniences and amenities town have to offer, we fantasized of what it would be like to have to build a fire in PJ's old wood stove that sat in his living room before going to bed, because if we didn't, we'd freeze to death after the temperatures dropped, potentially into the 30s or lower, after midnight. However, we were too shy to ask PJ if we could camp in his cabin. So one day, we went up to his cabin and we broke our backs doing a ton of yard work. PJ kept a yard around his cabin, maybe 20 yards by 20 yards cleared out. The rest of the area was forest. He mowed the yard portion with a push mower and he had a weed eater, and we knew where he kept all of his equipment, so we took it upon ourselves to go up and mow his grass. It looked like it had been a month since it had been mowed. We weeded after we mowed, and we gathered and stacked up any fallen tree limbs or branches that were within close proximity of his cabin, and we even went about and collected rocks and filled in holes on the small dirt driveway, which we'd later learn always got washed out when it rained. PJ came up about the time there were three of us, were finishing up with all the work he never asked us to do, and needless to say, he was very pleasantly surprised. He went on and on about how great the place looked, the whole while one of my buddies elbowing me, nudging me to ask him if we could stay in his cabin. And when I finally worked up the courage and did so, he laughed as hard as he could, and he said, "Well, of course. All you had to do was ask. Hope y'all fellers didn't come up here and do all this work thinking it was required in order to stay. You boys can stay up here anytime you want." And thus began our regular campouts at PJ's cabin. That first night, the night after we'd done all that back-breaking labor that wasn't necessary, we would learn something about our new friend PJ, quite a bit actually, as he came up and spent several hours with us before retreating to his new house he'd built down at the foot of the hill. We'd learned that PJ had been born and raised on this mountain. We'd learned that he left the area for 20 years to serve in the United States Navy. We found out he was a combat veteran of the Vietnam War. We found out that when he got back from the war, and after he'd retired from the Navy, he'd built this cabin with his own hands as a way to have a place to live far from mankind after what he'd experienced during his military career and his wartime service. And one of us, the author of these words, would come to understand exactly what he meant and why this was so important years later after his own wartime service. Just a quick break. I tell you, I can't imagine. Here's my place. That's my house way down there. These are my woods. That's our campground, my fields. You can't even see the entirety of it now. It's 6 acres because these meadows have grown up to forests now. And I tell you, I just couldn't imagine living any other way. You deal with the ugly side of humanity long enough, and you want to get away from all of it. It's all right. Nothing ugly out here. Nothing ugly out here. Except me. All right. Keep getting my 6. We also found out that PJ had lost a son, a young man named Marlon, who was about 20 years old when he'd passed, and he had passed while building his own cabin on the hill just above the one in which we were staying. Over the years, we would stay in that unfinished cabin as well, but always reluctantly and only rarely. And this is all part of PJ's first story. That first night in PJ's cabin, after we'd heard many stories of PJ's life's history, he told us a hunting story. He, his son Marlon, and another man, Bobby, used to go to this abandoned town I mentioned earlier and hunt squirrels in early October. They were drawn to the location, PJ told us, because the gray squirrels and fox squirrels there were not gray and red like they're supposed to be, but black. We asked him how in the world all the squirrels could be black, and he said he had reason to believe that there were dark forces still living within this old abandoned community. PJ explained that there were only half a dozen houses or so in the small community, which had been abandoned probably just before World War II. And inside the houses, it looked like nothing had been packed for a planned move. All the furniture was still in the houses, family pictures on the wall, and in one house there was even the remains of a meal on an old dinner table. It was as if, PJ told us, everyone just vanished into thin air. PJ, Marlon, and Bobby preferred to stay in one particular house when they'd go hunting there on the weekends, simply because it had been the house they stayed in on their first trip and they didn't see any need to change. And the stories PJ told of this house, they were bookworthy, but PJ was not a writer. He passed stories on the old-fashioned way, orally, and it's a true honor to have heard them and now, 30 years later, put at least one of them, this one, in a book. The last time we went there, he told us, we was all upstairs and Marlon and Bobby were sleeping, and I just couldn't sleep. The whole upstairs had been gutted, so it was just one big room. And we was laying there with our heads up against the wall, and I kept hearing what sounded like scratching sounds coming from the other side of the wall, like something was trying to get in. Well, he continued, seeing that we'd all been drawn in, and this was the part of our camping adventure we'd never planned on. Firing the wood stove, check. Already in a prime hunting location when the sun came up, check. Hearing one of the creepiest tales we'd ever hear in our lives, hadn't planned on it, but here we were, and the old storyteller had us hooked. I just reached my fist up and banged on the wall, he continued, and it sounded like these two little feet just took off running across a hardwood floor on the other side of the wall. Ran about 20 feet or so and stopped. But the thing was, there wasn't no room on the other side of that wall. Just the outside was out there, because it was the side of the house. Just as soon as I started trying to figure out how that was possible, he continued, I could hear what sounded like little feet scurrying back over to the wall. Sure enough, it got right back to the wall and it started scratching again, and I pounded the wall again with my fist and it scurried away. It came back and I scared it again, but this time after it scurried away, I didn't hear no little tiny feet scurrying back. I heard boom, 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 giant feet coming back like it had gone and gotten Mama, and Mama was bad. What'd you do? I said. I woke up Marlon and Bobby and told them we had to make a run for it because there was something on the other side of the wall, and they told me I was nuts and rolled back over and went back to sleep. I never heard no more scratching that night, and eventually I fell asleep. All kinds of weird stuff started happening after that, he said. Like the next day, I'd be out hunting all morning, and I came back to the house for lunch, and after I ate, I'd gone upstairs to take me a nap. I guess I didn't get near enough sleep the night before, with the scratching and the footsteps and all. So after I slept for a right good while, I woke up, and I heard footsteps downstairs. I go to the head of the stairs, and I look down, and Bobby's down there making him a sandwich and heating up a can of soup on our Coleman Kent stove for lunch. I asked him if he killed any squirrels, and he said he didn't see a single squirrel all morning. I told him to enjoy his lunch, and I went back to sleep. Well, I woke up about half an hour later, and I went downstairs to fix me a cup of coffee before heading back out in the woods to kill me some of those black squirrels, and here comes Bobby walking through the door. He had 4 of those black squirrels with him, and he told me he was going to skin them and clean them after he ate lunch. I said, Bobby, you was just in here eating lunch a little while ago. And he said, I've been out all day, PJ. You drinking already? And I wasn't. And I found the can of soup he'd heated up. It wasn't in the trash. Someone or something hadn't been there. But Bobby swore it wasn't him. And I watched him eat his soup and sandwich, and he was ravished. He didn't look like a man who'd just eaten lunch half an hour before. PJ took his 12-gauge pump-action shotgun and headed back into the woods. He shot a few squirrels that afternoon, but what happened at sundown, he said he'd never seen and he could never explain. Now, I know which way a shadow's supposed to fall, he said, on the opposite side of you that the sun's on. Huh? I asked him. As you can see, the shadow's back here. There's a tree, sun's over there, shadow's falling this way. When the sun started going down, he said, it's like there was some kind of glitch, like something you'd see on an old television after midnight, when the station signed off the air. And then, after that, all the shadows were being cast in the opposite direction they should have been. I'm telling you, boys, he said, and he slammed his right fist into the open palm of his left hand. I saw it, and it happened, and to this day, I can't explain it. When PJ got back to the house that evening, Bobby and Marlon were already there, and Marlon was out in the front of the house, just inside a massive brush and bramble pile you had to carefully cross to get to the front door of the house, carving his name into the side of a giant beech tree. What in the fool hell are you doing, boy? PJ asked Marlon when he saw what he was doing. You don't want to let this place know anything about you. But Marlon giggled and finished off the bottom of the letter N. I always knew they'd come back to haunt him, PJ said, and I could hear in his voice that he hadn't ruled out the idea that Marlon's carving of his name into that tree at this obviously haunted house and location may have caught up with him a year later, the year that he died. That night, while Marlon and Bobby slept, PJ lay awake, waiting for his little visitor to come back from the other side of the wall. But it didn't. Something else came. Bats, and lots of them. The reason the men slept up against one wall of the upstairs like they did was because the other wall on the opposite side of the room had fallen out. There was no wall. Basically, you could stand on that side of the upstairs of the house and look straight out into the forest. If you were to look down, you'd see the big brush and brambles pile that had to be crossed in order to get to the front door. PJ noticed the first bat because it had flown into the side of his head. But the next thing he knew, there was a whole swarm of bats flying around the room, and not just up at the ceiling. They'd filled the entire room from the ceiling to the floor, and they'd done so instantly, as if they just appeared out of thin air. Marlon and Bobby didn't need PJ to wake them up this time, as the screeching of the thousands of bats flying around them woke them up instead. All three men stood, hands and forearms shielding their faces, and started walking backwards. Rather, they were being pushed backward by the flying swarm of bats. When PJ realized they were being pushed backward toward the opening in the wall where they'd fall 2 floors if they continued, potentially to their deaths, he pulled a handgun he always kept on his side out of his holster and started shooting at the bats. It took until his third shot, but he hit one, and it dropped dead on the floor, and the thousands of others vanished instantly as if they'd never been there at all. "We're getting out of here now," PJ said to the other 2 men, and no one stood around to debate. They ran over and got their sleeping bags and then headed downstairs and packed their stuff in record time. PJ saw Bobby working his way through the brush pile and brambles to get out of the house's yard and over to their truck, and he followed suit. "And Marlon was just behind me, stepping on my heels, pushing me to go faster the whole time," PJ told us. "And I just kept saying, 'Damn it, Marlon, just wait. I'm going as fast as I can.' About that time, Bobby says, 'PJ, Marlon's over here with me.' And about that time, I hear Marlon say, 'Yeah, Dad, I came over first. And let me tell you, I only thought I was getting through them brambles as fast as I could. But after that, I got through there even faster.'" The guys got to their truck and they got in and they drove the rest of the night. They were back at PJ's house just as the sun came up, and they were still able to get some sleep afterward, but not much. And as you might imagine, they never went camping, hunting, hiking, or anything at that place again. A year later, in October, Marlon was cutting down trees on the hill just above PJ's cabin in order to build his own cabin. He was a grown man now, and it was time to move out, but he didn't want to leave the mountain he'd grown up on, just like his father before him. One of the trees he'd been cutting down, for some reason, kicked back the wrong way when it left the stump, and it crushed Marlon, killing him almost instantly. PJ never said that he thought Marlon may have brought something home with them from the haunted hunting place, because he'd carved his name in the old beech tree in the front yard, but he did say that when he'd seen Marlon doing it, he'd gotten an eerie feeling that was impossible to describe in words. And he's just always wished his son simply hadn't carved his name in that tree. My friends and I would go on to know PJ for many more years, and we would go on to spend many more nights in that cabin of his, and we would go on hearing many more of PJ's stories. Stories that I'm convinced if I'd never heard, and if I'd never heard them told by the man who told them, I would have never become a storyteller myself. I would have never become a writer. This very book you hold in your hands right now, that I hold and that I read to you, or which you may be viewing on your e-reading device during these amazing times of technology in which we live, can only be traced back to one source: PJ's cabin and all of those October nights. The end. So folks, I hope you enjoyed that story. All of it's true. Story told by the storyteller that ended up leading me to become a storyteller, just like yesterday's story with Charlie in England and his old teacher, John Smith. You never know who you might affect. You know, I wrote a novel called From the Graves of Babes. Many of you have read it. If you haven't, go to Amazon and get it, print or Kindle. And PJ's persona is one of the main characters named PJ in the book is based upon PJ's persona. I asked him for permission to do that. It's something you got to do as a writer. He was flattered, and I was flattered that he actually got to read the book before he passed away. It was published, I think, in 2011. Spent 6 months as Amazon's #1 rated ghost novel in customer satisfaction, beating out A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. Gosh, what a blank I'm drawing. I actually have a collection of his ghost stories I'm reading now because it's October. And it stayed there for 6 months until Christmas season came back around. And then, of course, Charles Dickens took back over the #1 spot. And From the Graves of Babes, never saw it again. But PJ got to read it. He loved it. And then he passed away just a few short years later. He's been gone close to a decade now, but certainly not forgotten. And I am honored to be able to tell his story and tell the stories he told me to potentially millions of people, on social media. So thanks for being here, and I'm looking forward to seeing you here again tomorrow for another October night.